Yes, I'm guessing this is a somewhat different audience to the one I normally speak with. So my background is very much as a scholar of propaganda and information warfare. And I've been in that field since I did my PhD, which I got at Glasgow University in 2011, which looked at counterterrorism and propaganda since 9/11. I had mainly focused on the sort of digitalization of propaganda and changing nature of war during that long period, and sort of moved more into looking at politics after my PhD. But I've always maintained that interest in information warfare. And part of my research was looking at the sort of private companies that are involved in information warfare, working for British and American governments. And I did interviews, for instance, with the parent company of Cambridge Analytica, among a lot of different influence firms that were working for our governments during the counterterrorism conflicts. And that was kind of how I came to exposing my role in exposing the wrongdoing of Cambridge Analytica in 2018 through the British fake news inquiry. Now, up to that point, I had first encountered them as a defense contractor, but began to sort of know a lot more about what they were doing in politics and researched that extensively, became very aware of sort of unethical activities through the documents I'd been looking at. And it's through that really that I've started to become very interested in cyber operations, and because I think a lot of these firms, don't necessarily have anything to do with cyber operations. But I was intrigued by noticing things like a malware hash on the website of Cambridge Analytica, and of hearing about different ways that the company seemed to be being targeted through my research. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And but for me, I think the most shocking thing was when I saw evidence that slides that they had produced mentioned DDoS attacks, for example. So I was increasingly interested, but also needing to sort of understand more about this dimension. Now, I'm also British. I was living in the US during 2016 when the elections were going on, witnessing both the, the attacks by Russia and the aftermath of them, and really being a part of that whole conversation around Cambridge Analytica, their relationship to Russia, and what should be done about this whole area. I mean, it's a very complex situation, and this obviously sparked a lot of interest beyond the usual realm of propaganda for me. Offensive cyber is normally defined in terms of the hardware, so computer network attacks on physical hardware. So of the kind that I'm just mentioning, the attack on Cambridge Analytica by by malware, which was of unknown origin. I still haven't figured that one out. Which, obviously impacts on this can be done for all sorts of different purposes, can be used to manipulate software, to steal information, as likely was the case in this example, or to close down systems. Smeets and Lin define it as a capability designed to access a computer system or network to damage or harm living or material entities. So there's a wide range, obviously, of offensive cyber capabilities. And adopting this definition, they exclude espionage, information warfare, and information operations from their analysis. So I really want to come at this from the perspective of somebody who has witnessed the whole Cambridge Analytica thing and Russian attacks in 2016 from the midst of being somebody revealing information around that, and seeing how these things have become very much more involved and related, and looking at this definition and feeling that it's somewhat problematic in our contemporary world. So I'm going to start by, so first of all, offensive cyber is used for deterring, defending adversary military action, for compelling a change in actions, for instance, or for preventive or preemptive strikes. Now, one thing that's always been the case is the centrality of psychology in warfare. So the psychological domain has always been centrally important to warfare. You know, confronting an enemy, you want to be undermining their will to fight, their belief in victory. You may wish to destabilize and demoralize the adversary, to weaken their control over the population, for instance. So these psychological aspects are central. Genghis Khan was known for his brutality, of course, but also used deception to create psychological defeats. So, for instance, he used the threat of brutal destruction to gain compliance without needing a fight, but also exaggerated his perceived force. So, for instance, ordering officers at nighttime on the hill to light 3 lamps so that they looked 3 times bigger as an army than they really were. They would, you know, attach objects to the back of their horses' tails to drag up more dust to make sure it looked like the army, that when the army was approaching, that it was bigger than it really was. So this is not unusual in warfare, these kinds of tactics. We've seen in the Iraq War, for instance, the shock and awe effort to display an overwhelming sense of power, to bring a sense of you know, imminent defeat, and demoralize Iraqi forces. With traditional weapons, though, it was possible to see the buildup. You've got a visible force that you can, you know, use to demonstrate power. Offensive cyber is essentially hidden and is much closer to the sense of the Cold War and its psychological power. The power is created in essence through continual invisible insecurity that may be being created in the society. And I think that is certainly what we saw in 2016 developing in the United States. And I would say that that hasn't really shifted since. The power is in the sense of the society having been invisibly penetrated, and also in the unknown extent of the destructive reach. And I would say that that also is something that has, you know, dramatically affected the US military's self-perception and its belief in its own inability to tackle this problem. Really has a lot of parallels with the beginning of the War on Terror, when the massive strike on the terrorist attacks on the Twin Towers had this gigantic psychological effect on the country, and really led to quite a profound transformation in American military capabilities, and an escalation as well in response. So this kind of a tool, I would say, even more so than in the Cold War with nuclear weapons. You know, offensive cyber is a psychological weapon before, during, and after it has a physical presence. So in the sense that, you know, nuclear weapons, we had all of the images that were associated with this, with mushroom clouds and so on, and the space race. We also, when it comes to the cyber attacks, it's the battle to create a sense of power and to create compliance and change behaviors as a result of having these cyber capabilities is something that really is going to be created in the mind. So in 2016, of course, Putin ordered these cyber attacks and the accompanying influence operations to disrupt the 2016 election against Clinton for Trump. Whether or not local or foreign influence operations were what put Trump in power, accelerated cyber attacks and influence operations during the US election in 2016 had a profound and deliberate psychological effect. And I think this can't be underestimated. And I think in the responses, it is not really, I think we're seeing these as two separate issues, two separate types of attack, and really it's one and the same. So the influence operation was essential to the power and to the purpose of the cyber attacks, of course. And the fear and outraged hubris of American power actually amplified the effects of the attack. The sense of unsettling societal disruption and uncertainty undermined the sense of control, and this kind of hack would not be as powerful without its psychological engineering that accompanied it. Some of which would have been obviously, just the societal reaction, which amplifies the attack. But it was aiming, of course, ultimately to demoralize and weaken the enemy of Russia, so the United States, destabilize, and to demonstrate and exaggerate the unknown extent of Putin's power. I want to jump into the domestic election that was obviously taking place at that time as well, and my own research on Cambridge Analytica. Now, some of the, we've obviously heard a lot about the relationship between Cambridge Analytica and Russia. The Senate Intelligence Committee report, volume 5 into Russia was inconclusive on this, but stressed the heavy evidence that there were ties between Cambridge Analytica and Russia, Russian oligarchs, for instance. One thing I would say is that I think this risk is something that is really to be very much taken seriously, and something to be really worrying about in terms of future elections. So what I would say is it's not just that these companies having these ties and so on, but also what could be done with data in 2016. That's what 5 years ago now, and what could be done now with these the attacks that we're seeing more recently, I think should concern us greatly. So, what was the big deal in 2016? People kept saying, well, a lot of companies use social media data, and why should we really be worried about the Cambridge Analytica data? Well, I would say that this ocean modeling of the Facebook data that was stolen, taken without consent, of 87 million people, it was modeled on a psychological test called Ocean. This has been experimented with somewhat. There are conflicting accounts of how effective Ocean is for all sorts of things, like selling dog food to electing politicians. One thing that Cambridge Analytica found in their own internal evaluations of the method was the most effective, was the targeting of neurotics with fear-driven messaging. Now, I would say that this is probably the most concerning thing in what they were doing. So they were doing experiments on hundreds of thousands of Americans who were classified as neurotic, so more likely to be prone to stress and anxiety and things like this, to try targeting them with the most alarming and most disturbing messaging that they could. This was done through the PAC Make America #1, or Crooked Hillary. And obviously this is the stuff that was most using the Russian hacked information. And of course it was using this kind of, very disturbing branding and so on. These are actually some of the messaging that was produced was really quite unsettling. And although this is kind of almost more tame, I would say, some of the images I'm using, it was definitely very much designed to induce fear. We've now seen, you may have come across the film People You May Know, which I helped with last year. It came out in October 2020, just before the election. This was looking at the Cambridge Analytica's role in misuse of church data. You will have seen probably reports that Steve Bannon had been using data from the churches. The lead researcher on this project, Brent Allpress, has found a lot of mispurposing of data from an app that was created between a religious Christian tech company called Glue and a collaboration with Cambridge Analytica. I've done research myself for my book on the Cambridge Analytica side of this. Now, you might be saying, well, why churches? Why do we care about the churches? Well, in this particular data sample, the evangelical sample was very, very important. And this was a really important audience for Trump. And also quite significant when it comes to the January 6th campaign, to the campaign leading up to the January 6th riots and insurrection in the Capitol building. The same people who were behind this particular mispurposing of data from churches for politics were actually also involved, it seems, in the Stop the Steal campaigns, which led to those attacks. It's really important because Brent Allpress also has found that the same companies were using the data platform that was created with the Cambridge Analytica work and Glue to actually to drive apps that were for mental health, counseling, and to help people with financial problems, addiction problems, relationship stress. So this basically was then being sold to political campaign firms in the United States. Now, the significance of this and this kind of data I want to highlight, because this being marketed to all of these kinds of very vulnerable communities was leading in the lead up to a time when America finds itself in a national crisis, one that's a financial crisis, a mental health crisis, and a digital dependency crisis, as well as, of course, a physical health crisis. The country has been going through hell, to put it quite frankly, and then we've seen throughout the development of this this abuse of data, from a transition from the Pizzagate of 2016 to QAnon and Stop the Steal. So there's been a debilitating attack on trust, media credibility, and rising disinformation in parallel. And I would say that more powerful than the attack on disinformation is this attack on trust and the digital dependency, which creates this kind of asymmetry between the individual and the dark data that's operating behind everything that they're interacting with, which really they are not in an ability to anticipate how this is being utilized against them. There's also this kind of cultural coherence that's created between these campaigns and the individual to create a sense of trust, which overrides the cognitive dissonance that might be created with lies. So the building of these kinds of bonds and the psychology of utilizing essentially, mental health and neuroscience really to drive these kinds of campaigns is really quite, I would say, quite a lot more concerning than even whether the messaging is false or true. And I would say that conspiracy theories really fed by the targeted paranoia are, essential to the cybersecurity response. So we need to be thinking about how, how these kinds of methods could then be countered essentially with de-escalating responses, transparency, and building trust, as well as, of course, protecting data. So the mass harvesting of the kind we've seen, data being made vulnerable, both through cyber attacks and pools of data just left open on the internet and so on, makes campaigns more like PSYOP possible within domestic politics, using neurotargeting and mental health data to target protected categories such as anxiety and depression, which could then subsequently be used for things like voter suppression also. These can be both fueled and exploited by foreign actors. And we saw that, I think, extensively in 2016. And also maybe in 2018 as well. And responding to these kinds of hacks and data breaches is essential to consider the psychological weaponry that also is being used in parallel as inseparable, I would say, from cyber. To bring me back to my Cambridge Analytica research again, one of the things that concerned me was, so this I said already, this was a company that was working for our governments, working for NATO and so on, doing strategic communications, both the target audience analysis for PSYOPs, as well as for training audiences. So in 2015, they were training Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova in methods to counter Russia. On the same day that this workshop happened, that you're looking at a section of the document for, the 19th of February 2015, Cambridge Analytica, so part of the same umbrella company, was making a simultaneous pitch for a campaign for Lukoil, which is a Russian oil company. And it seems from my research that Russia was most likely, not just with this, but also you could see from the fact that there is a malware hash that looks like it was being part of an operation to try to steal information from the company. I believe that this particular document that you're looking at was phished. I found out in about April 2015 when it appeared on a Russian propaganda page. And I talked to the Ministry of Defense at the time, and it I believe was phished from the company. So these companies become targets, obviously. We also saw that, potentially in the case of Snowden, although that's disputed, of course. But these kinds of enemies are targeting companies that are potentially working on both sides, and the firewalls that these companies claim are only as trustworthy as the people are. So I would say also that it's worth being aware of how these companies are played off themselves. Now, bringing it back to the Russian the Senate intelligence report of last year on Cambridge Analytica and Russia, it highlights how Cambridge Analytica data from the Trump campaign was actually provided to a pro-Putin oligarch in Ukraine. And the data from Cambridge Analytica was also being accessed from Russia. That's something that's being investigated, and we don't really know any more about that, unfortunately. But it's very concerning to think that essentially this would be the type of data I've just been talking about, which was modeled for mental health, and certainly for anxiety and neurotics. I would say also there is mental health data out there. Where have I got lost? Sorry. There's mental health data out there on the internet anyway. But what I'm trying to do is to emphasize that how this data is potentially now being used for influence campaigns, and that we need to see these things as very, very heavily related. So again, as I was saying, Cambridge Analytica were also at that time pitching to Lukoil. So Herblin has commented that while offensive cyber is sort of hacking this physical infrastructure, its human counterpart of psychological operations can be likened perhaps to hacking minds. The Trump campaign in 2016 was not just about disinfo. It was actually the rise, I would say, of neuro-targeting in a way that we haven't really contemplated it properly before. There's been very little discussion around this. Most of the focus has been on the disinformation. But really, we need to be thinking about how our minds are being moved in ways that aren't necessarily as obvious as whether something is false or true. We are looking at our psychological state as human infrastructure, an essential infrastructure that is under attack. They are essentially bypassing our rational processes, and I think we need to be really very heavily aware of how we are being essentially targeted with efforts to undermine our ability to rationally address problems and debate. So this kind of increasing importance of the dual aspects of the tech and hardware and the human infrastructure of our minds has not really been addressed enough by scholars. And we've seen a transition after this massive attack on the United States in 2016, similar to the response to 9/11, of an escalation of cyber offensive cyber, moving from the position of developing cyber options that control conflict escalation towards the persistent action to maintain cyberspace superiority, more of a preemptive interventionist strategy on cyber. In response, we've also seen SolarWinds and many, many other escalating attacks, I would say, from Russia. The legal and ethical concerns around the change in US strategy have been sort of raised around targeting power grids and other civilian infrastructure. And in a democracy especially, such actions need to be limited and proportionate. So this issue of defense, some have argued that offensive cyber has little proven deterrent value. And some also have argued that new policies indicate actual escalation and that might well be very dangerous. Now, I would say this is kind of where the psychological dimensions come in, and where these two disciplines need to be maybe commenting on each other more. Robert Chesney, a law professor from the University of Texas, has been quoted as saying that it represents 21st century gunboat diplomacy. So the sense that we're showing the adversary we can inflict serious costs without actually doing much. Now, the key to inflicting serious costs without actually doing much is kind of also about the perception of the enemy, of course. So you may not see the sort of cyber ships coming. It's not necessarily a visible weapon in the same way, but deterrence must be seen and proven to actually be effective. So in a sense, we've got the example you can look at would be Snowden, where you know, actually this massive attack on the United States really had an effect of increasing the perception of the credibility of America's threat, and you know, it means that it's more likely to be effective as a deterrent. Perhaps even beyond the reality of what America's capable of, or was capable of at that time. The offensive cyber operations can compel leaders, though, to change direction, saving face where not exposed publicly. But also we need to perhaps think about demonstrating enough damage to be perceived as costly enough to change action. Again, this would be where psychological operations comes in, which influences the behavior of a foreign target audience to support national security interests. Oops. Oh, sorry. Objectives. So likely for democracies, you know, they will need to begin considering more the audiences and anticipating a range of likely responses, and involving psychological operations in planning for the audience perceptions and behaviors on the ground. The psychological component and the guiding perception is therefore central to both deterrence and compellence in offensive cyber. The demonstrations of power, of course, will rest on the accompanying propaganda. For example, minimizing the physical damage, but maximizing pressure may involve organizing rallies against leaders and campaigns, for instance. Audience and approach may be different for communicating credibility or deterrence and compelling leadership. And psychological operations personnel, I would imagine, would be, you know, increasingly involved in trying to help understand, you know, the value of whether to communicate at all. So audience and approach may well be different for communicating this credibility and deterrence and compelling leadership to act or to change actions. Western governments will recognize increasingly that the outcomes rest firmly on the accompanying activities in the psychological domain, and will increase use of psychological operations and probably also deception operations or denial around such attacks. Deception operations are defined as information designed to manipulate the behavior of others by inducing them to accept a false or distorted presentation of their environment, physical, social, or political. Now, importantly, this isn't just about disinformation. This is about changing the environment and circumstances within which the enemy may well be making decisions. So at the moment, there is a minimal discussion around the relationship between psychological operations and offensive cyber. And but given this kind of central role that it should have, doctrinal implications that should be thought about both from the perspective of propaganda researchers like me and also for offensive cyber community. So the US has been sort of combining these capabilities more and threatened Russian elites' personal information could be hit with an attack ahead of the 2020 elections to sort of try to, do essentially what the Russians did in the sense of threatening to release damaging information about elites. But they were also stressing that they were not targeting the Russian population. Substantial issues could be raised, though, by cyber attacks that aim at psychological effects in this kind of way without properly planning or thinking these through with psychological operations who obviously may well be working in parallel on other aspects of the behavioral change. Understanding the psychological dimension could instead guide practice down a pathway away from sort of playing Russia at its own game, which we really don't want to be turning towards, and turning tools back on the enemy that they used against us towards harm minimization and deterrence. And I would say, although, this was obviously a deterrent. So trying to communicate the threat of Russian elites' personal information being released may well have been impactful. But, this is something that, if you really want to have an impact with a threat of this kind, you need to be thinking about this far more through the psychological operations mechanisms. So hacking and leaking are really the kind of contemporary counterside of the influence coin. And there needs to be like a recognition that this kind of hacking and releasing, from our point of view as well, is likely to persist. So, the way that this was used by Russia in recent elections in the UK too, there have been a heck of a lot of damaging releases on Syria, for instance. And this kind of thing is going to continue likely because the systems are just not really secure enough. I would stress that that one of the big weaknesses that I can see from my perspective as somebody who researched Cambridge Analytica is the firms that are employed by our governments and the systems of contracting, the influence industry that's out there, which has a lot of hubris and believes in its ability to not be targeted, and I would say is very, very vulnerable to the kinds of targeting that I've talked about, but also the sort of social engineering that often happens. And I would say managing these kinds of attacks on us by also welcoming journalism that reports on and analyzes the releases is actually a better way to sort of manage those attacks, and moving away the audiences from state-funded propaganda outlets like RT and the small kind of ideological outlets that essentially republish and amplify them, would be far more effective than a lot of what we're doing at the moment. We also need to make our systems more secure with defensive cyber and potentially deception to prevent attacks, as well as not sending things out to these kinds of companies, being more vigilant about the trustworthiness and security of these firms. The psychological impacts of offensive cyber and how these are mitigated or influenced should be a lot more integral conceptually. And we need to sort of be thinking about broadening the concept around whether or not the offensive cyber is seeking to influence populations and building in that psychological component at that level. I would say it's also essential that we need to be thinking about and anticipating and better understanding how influence and offensive cyber interact in and especially in their ethical and legal implications, because a lot of the discussions I'm seeing around offensive cyber are not tackling this issue of the psychological component. And I would also say that I'm seeing a lot of discussion in information operations around the changing audiences at the same time that I'm seeing discussion in cyber around changing borders and the internationalization of war, I suppose, essentially. The fact that the home and foreign are very, very difficult to distinguish in warfare nowadays. And these, I think, are also discussions we need to be having together. So I want to end there. I hope this has raised a lot of interesting points and discussion points that we could maybe talk about in the questions. But I just want to reinforce this sense of how important I think the Cambridge Analytica example is to demonstrating how these things come together in the context of trying to build in an understanding of how our psychology is being hacked, if you like, in relation to the technological breaches that are going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much for the amount that you just included within about 45 minutes. Absolutely exceptional.
That was okay.
Absolutely. So now we've got time for questions, but Neil is going to take the lead on this now. I'll be sitting back and doing more of the tech side. So I know that we've got some people raising hands, and we'll have people having questions through the Q&A too.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Emma, for a really, really interesting presentation. I can see there is one hand raised already from Daniel. Oh, sorry, so I apologise. Michael? I apologise, yes.
Thanks, Emma. Really nice presentation. Just wondering, if you take a look at some of the scenarios that have been happening. So you have the Texas weather-related blackout, which is that we had recently in the weather-related, and it could easily have been nudged even further with the cyber hit, and then nudged further with some propaganda, right? The Suez Canal blockage, yet another one where you have these just naturally occurring, or just complex system we live in. These events occur, and then they can get leveraged with just a nudge. Even just a simple DDoS attack can really do a lot of damage when a system is stressed, and then you come in with some intense propaganda. So just some thoughts on that. I don't know if I've seen a lot of that, but I could see that to be like the next wave. Leverage these events that occur. Thanks.
Yeah, I agree. I think this will be being used more. I mean, for me, okay, I'm going to be quite blunt, and I'm going to say this scares me. I'll be honest, it scares me. I'm not the sort of person who advocates propaganda, okay? And yet, I would say that, we don't want an all-out cyber war. We do not. And the leverage, I think, that can be gained when it comes to, communicating the impact of cyber weapons, to be able to sort of emphasize things that are already happening, for instance, and try to shift sentiment and perceptions around to something that perhaps accelerates the impact that they might have, while minimizing the actual damage to especially when it comes to the power systems and things like this. I think this is a really delicate one, and I think it's right that people have been concerned about these kinds of attacks. But what you can actually do with the propaganda dimension of this, it needs to be brought in, not just like adding on, like you say, after something has occurred, but also thinking around, like, what ways should we be thinking about the audience beforehand like, how are people going to receive this? What, is the emotional reaction going to be? What is going to be the perception of leaders? Are they going to be blamed? If you look at, for instance, lessons can be drawn from other kind of contexts. So Iran, for instance, around the time when sanctions were being introduced, there was all of the effort to try to, get the population to blame the leaders. So you're looking at ways in which blame can be shifted, or the outcome of the events can be, turned in a different direction to try to get people to put pressure on Putin, for instance, to try to shift the actual situation in the country's leadership. The oligarchs, for instance, I think one thing that was positive about the US threat in 2019 about, like, don't do this again, or we're coming for you, was very much, it was aimed at the oligarchs. And the relationship, obviously, between Putin and his oligarchs has been fairly shaky, I would say. And there's a lot of pressure that could be used in order to sort of affect that relationship. So I think these kinds of levers should be being thought of a lot more in advance and planned around what can be actually achieved. Does that answer your question? Sorry, I hope so.
We have a question now from Amy Urton, which is about deterrence. She asks, how can a state determine the right level of offensive cyber operations to demonstrate their capabilities and to be perceived as too difficult a target? Does it all just become double or triple bluffs?
Yes, I mean, this, honestly, I don't do the population research and this side of things. I think this would be really for intelligence analysts, not me. But I would say that, this kind of anticipatory, data is there, I would say. It's obviously something that's, not an exact science. And there is always going to be, an element of uncertainty around, how much force to use. And to use not enough force perhaps is also unhelpful, because you then will have this kind of sense of not showing what you're capable of and having also shown your hand. So, the weighing of this obviously is a really delicate matter, because the United States also doesn't want to be seen to be being an aggressor. So I would say that, sorry if that's not an easy answer. That's not, I would say, an answer to your question, because I don't think there is one that can be applied to every situation. But I would say that there needs to be not just intelligence behind this, but also kind of behavioral understanding of how leaders are going to react. And it will depending on the leader as well. Putin is very different from other leaders. So you want to be thinking in that sense of these kinds of political psychologists coming in to speak around this as well.
Excellent. A question now from Joe Burton. He says, great talk. He says, I study strategic culture and cyber, which is about ideas and beliefs and behavior. Are these things part of psychology, he asks? And are the ideas that exist in militaries or hacker communities or in intelligence agencies, for example, shaping cyber policy and the use of offensive capabilities?
Sorry, can you say that again? I know that was quite a long question as well, sorry.
Yeah, so I think the key of the question is, are there already existing ideas in terms of within militaries or within groups like hacker communities or within intelligence agencies around things like ideas, how you manipulate ideas and belief and behavior and things like that?
Yes, of course, absolutely. I mean, there's like so much theory behind this. It's been going on since the beginning of time. And I mean, the weird thing is, I don't think it really is being applied. You say to hacker communities and things like this. I don't really think it's beginning to enter this kind of area, unfortunately, yet. And I think that we will see this happening more and more. But at the moment, I still see that there's this kind of technical divide, you know, like with people not really talking. I mean, the one place where it does come in is obviously things like social engineering. And there's discussion going on around Cambridge Analytica and whether they are actually, you know, data-driven social engineering. And, you know, so this kind of like gaining entry and so on obviously has this kind of psychological dimension to it already, but I just don't think that the two have really been fused yet. And I see that coming, I really do, especially around deception. And I do think that governments are starting to recognize the increasing utility of deception, whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think scholars like me need to be thinking more around deception. We have focused a lot on disinformation, and, you know, this is something that, you know, is I think under theorized a lot of the time. I've been seeing a lot of people just talking about whether something's false or true. That doesn't make it effective. It doesn't make it, you know, something that is going to be engaging people or changing behaviors. You know, deception I see at play more and more, because you want to not necessarily show your hand, and it could be very much used in ethical ways to minimize harm, to think about how you might be able to offer a leader a way out of, you know, the escalation strategy that they have been, you know, moving forward on, and without, you know, allowing them to sort of save face, if you like. So I think these kinds of strategies would be ethical and more, you know, of more utility than they are being made at the moment. But I think we're going that way.
We have far too many questions for the time we have left, so I'm going to try and smush some questions together into one. We have an anonymous question asking about ethics. Do you think it would be ethical to conduct cyber operations against military or government units that are committing human rights abuses? And they give an example from Myanmar more recently. And then, just to get all of the biggest possible issues into one question, we have a question from Phil Sherriff, who asks about the historical focus on Russia that you've been talking about, and he asks how you see the rise of China's activities and information manipulation affecting things. So there's two questions. Is it ethical to do this against people who are doing bad things? And do you think the rise of China is really going to change the way this all works?
Okay, so do you think it'll be ethical to conduct cyber operations against somewhere like the military in Myanmar? Yes. Yes. You know, and I think this kind of thing is actually probably vital, and you know, to this. I would rather see this kind of thing than, you know, deception operations in the main. When I'm talking about deception, I'm thinking of it more in the sense of, you know, protecting activities and enabling them to have a, you know, a harm reduction aspect. Because I think deception can have that effect, and it just depends on what you're talking about when you're talking about deception. But, you know, these are questions that we need to discuss. It really is. And, you know, how you then would, you know, bring the you know, people on side when there are actual human rights abuses going on. You know, the communication of that is going to be vital. You know, you've got places where people, where the leadership, you know, the military are in control of the, you know, propaganda. They're shutting down, you know, communications. And, you know, this is going to have such an important, you know, propaganda dimension to it, to make it go effectively. But these are the people we should be targeting, you know. I think one of the things that we've been doing too much of is trying to move populations. Really, actually, what we should be doing is thinking about the bad actors behind them and thinking about how we can, you know, influence their behaviors. And I would say, you know, cyber is one of them. And I think that's far more ethical than trying to manipulate a population. Yeah.
That is a really good answer, and also probably about all we have time for, I think. Is that Andy? Right, Andy? But
yeah, unfortunately, we're 2 minutes, well, probably 1 minute to the hour. So I always try and keep meetings on to the hour if I can. But thank you so much, Emma, for that really fantastic talk. And there are some questions that you might be able to look at as well that are in the Q&A for your perusal. And unfortunately, the people who got to ask those didn't get those answered today. But I'm